Down on the shelf below the underglazes are the slips. And again, with this semester, I'm not going to require that you use the slips, but I will show you a demonstration of how to use them if you want to. They are basically colored clay that's in the liquid form, and you apply it to the surface of leather hard clay to have a color that you can use that way, carve back through. I'll show you a lot of different ways that you can use slips. But we have a variety of colors, and again, just like with your underglazes and your stains, you need to look at the test tile to see what color you're going to get. So this is the test tile for the slips, and I'm not quite sure how well the colors come through on the video, but you'll see this in person. It's super important that you look at this to see what the actual color turns to when it's fired. Some of them are similar to the container, other ones are not similar at all. Like the tan is pink in the container and it's tan on the tile. A lot of people get upset about the green because it doesn't look the kind of chartreuse color it is in the container. So it's super important that you look at this test tile to know what the color is going to look like when it's fired with glaze on it. And again, we'll head over to the demonstration table and I'll show you different ways you can use slips. In this video, we're going to talk about slip application techniques. The slips we have in the studio are all on the shelf, which you saw a video of things that were on the shelf. And these are the slips. It's really important that you look at this test tile that sits next to containers so you can see what it's going to look like when it's finished. It's going to look different in some cases than what's in the container. In some cases, a lot different. So please, please, please look at this test tile before you decide the colors you're going to use. Most of what we're doing here today can also be done with the commercial underglazes, just sometimes maybe at a slightly different consistency. I'm going to use the slips, but know that you can do a lot of these things with underglazes as well. So when we apply slips to anything, we're going to need to have a decent thickness of slip on there to counteract the glaze. So if it's too thin, the glaze will just sort of eat through the color. And slips are just liquid clays, basically. Liquid clays that we've formulated and added a colorant to get it to be a certain color. So I'm going to go through a few techniques here, and we'll bounce around. There's a sheet that you'll have access to read off what I'm doing. And you can kind of follow along. We'll kind of bounce between things because I need time for things to set up before I can move on. The first on the list is paper transfer. And this is a way to repeatedly transfer a design onto the surface of the clay. So I drew out a few designs. This also works well for things that you've printed off the computer. I would say if you're doing a repeated design and you've hand drawn it, go and get it photocopied and print out a few copies of it so that, because these wear out as you use them, and it'd be good to have multiple copies. If you're printing off the computer, just print off multiple copies at the scale that you need them so you can replace it when it gets too worn out. So I'm going to demonstrate doing paper transfer onto just the clay and onto slip that I've already applied. But first, we talked about needing multiple layers for the slip. I've put down 2 layers of slip, and like in the glaze when we talked about, the slip needs to be applied in different directions so you don't build up brush strokes. So I've applied a layer that's horizontal, I've applied a layer that's vertical this way, and I need to apply a 3rd layer that's diagonal. And I do that so I don't build up texture from the brush strokes. Now you might want to do that for certain things, but if we're trying to get a flat surface, we don't want to build up texture. And you want to wait until the slip is dry to the touch in between coats. If you leave the slip wet, you're not going to actually build up thickness. You're just going to move around the slip that's already there. So you have to let it dry back to the consistency of the clay before you work with it, before you add another layer, or work with it really. So I'm going to get my slip, and when you first open these slip containers, there's going to be water floating on top, the heavier stuff at the bottom. I've already mixed some slips up, but there are these spatulas that are in that area that you can use to mix the slips. Be careful taking the lids off of the slips. They are plastic, and if you just kind of like try to do it all from one area and bend the lid, they will crack. So make sure you're careful opening the lids. If you do find a cracked lid, we just need to replace it with one that isn't cracked. There are extras sitting up on the shelf. So make sure you mix up those slips thoroughly. They are definitely way thicker than the glazes and way thicker than water. They should be spreadable. If it seems really thick, let myself or my technician know so that we can thin them out. Please don't add water to things yourself. It'll end up being too thin, and then we won't be able to use it very well. So I'm going to apply the final coat to here, which is diagonal coat, and I just want to float the brush across the surface. I talk about this when we're talking about glaze as well, but you load up the brush with lots of slip, and you just sort of float that brush across the surface. I want to avoid brush strokes as much as I can and avoid bumps and lumps. So float it across. I'll put the brush back in the container, and I'm going to put the lid on top of it just to keep the air out of that as much as possible. When I'm finished using completely, I want to put it away. So I need to let that coat dry before, or set up before I can use it. So we'll demonstrate paper transfer onto just the bare clay for now. So if I was doing a paper transfer, I'd pick whatever design I wanted, and I'd use a ball stylus, or I can just use a ballpoint pen, and I'm going to trace the design that I want. You can trace different designs. So what this does for you is, and I'm not sure if the cameras can pick it up, but it leaves this embossed line anywhere that you've written, which could be a design in and of itself, or you could go back and then carve more deeply into it, or add other things to that. So that's what paper transfer is. You can transfer exactly what's on the paper but via tracing onto the clay. And I'll show you that in just a little bit as this dries again. So stencils is what's next on the list. And stencil is the idea of using paper as a resist to the slip. Now I'm just going to do something really simple like squares, and I'm going to put down some paper squares and then use slip over them. Now I want to adhere the paper to the clay just a little bit, so I want to spritz it with water from my spray bottle. And I don't need to be too wet, so I'm just kind of rub that in a little bit, and then I'm going to stick down these squares of paper. You can do really, really complex stencils. I had a student once do a silhouette of an elephant as a stencil, and it came out great. You can get some really, really crisp edges. We seal this paper down to the surface. So if you've ever done stenciling with paint, the most important thing is to start off by using a thin layer of paint, or in this case slip, and brushing off the edges of the stencils so that it seals them down and you don't get the color underneath the paper, which would make the edges not crisp. So you go around and you carefully brush off of the stencil onto the clay, sealing down those edges. So I want to let that set up and then put thicker layers on top of it. So again, we're going to pause and go on to something else while we wait for that to happen. The next part is monoprint. So there are two ways to do monoprint, and we might have to wait for things to set up a little bit. The first is sort of like carbon paper. So I have 3 layers of slip on this paper. This is newsprint. We have newsprint in the studio. This stencil is also newsprint. Newsprint resists breaking down when it's wet, which is really helpful for what we're doing. So I have those 3 layers of slip on this newsprint, and I'm going to use this like carbon paper to transfer an image in slip onto the clay. Now this is still too wet. This needs to be at a really particular state. It needs to still be flexible, but it needs to not come off on your hand when you touch it. It needs to be like the feeling of this clay, leather hard to the touch, but the paper should be still very flexible and nothing cracking off. It's a little bit of a finicky process because it's so specific in the consistency that you need. So we just have to wait on this. Put this back down and wait. The other type of monoprint is sort of like using more painterly or gestural strokes and then applying it to the clay. So sometimes we're working on a form that's really hard to get to. It's vertical or it's curved in such a way that makes it really hard to paint something or draw something that you really want to draw. So if you create a template for that piece, you can then paint slip onto it in the way that you might want to do, and then apply the whole thing to the surface of the piece. So I have this piece of newsprint that I used, and on it I first put down some green, and then I let that set up to leather hard, and then I put a layer of yellow over the top of it. And you can get super detailed with this process. You can get many layers, many different colors. As long as you let it set up in between, you can always get more and more layers. And when this process works best, it has at least like 3 layers of slip. When I do this, I purposely left some areas thin, and you can see that the color kind of tears out more. When it's thin, it stays attached to the paper, which might be something you're looking for as an effect, but knowing that it's going to happen. And the thing to remember about this is it's kind of like painting on glass. If you paint the back of glass, the thing you put down first is what's going to be in the foreground, and then it builds up behind it after that. So you couldn't put your background color down first, or all you'd see was the background color. So this is not leather hard yet. With this process, you should let it get close to leather hard. It doesn't have to be quite as dry as the carbon paper technique because we're going to apply the whole thing. So I don't need it to not adhere in places, but I'm going to let this dry up a little bit more before I do anything with it. On the paper that you have, stamping is listed. Now stamping is more of a clay technique rather than a slip technique, but stamping is very simply anything that makes an impression in the clay. Anything that makes a stamp is a stamp. So I can use this bolt, I could use an edge of anything. Anything can be a stamp. And that can create textures, it can create different opportunities for making interesting carvings and textures. After stamping is wiping back, and there are 2 ways to wipe back. You can wipe back at the leather hard stage, which is what this is, or you can wipe back at the bone dry stage. So to wipe back at the leather hard stage, again, I'm going to just take a piece of newsprint, whatever shape you want it to be, and I'm going to wet the surface of my clay just a bit and stick that newsprint down. Now that's adhered. I'm going to take a small sponge that's wet, and I'm going to start wiping back. I'm going to wipe off, much like the stencils, how you have to do the slip off the edges of the stencil. I need to wipe off the edge of this. And speaking of my stencil, that is dried up enough for me to add another layer of slip. So now that my edges are sealed down, I don't have to worry about getting slip underneath so much. So I'm going to apply a nice even coat. Looks like I might have one place where my stencil didn't stick down all the way. So we'll see how that turns out. Let that dry again before we add another layer, and we'll go back to wiping. This is definitely a more subtle technique. You're basically making this raised area wherever the paper is. And the more you wipe back, the more raised it's going to be. And as I do this, I'm getting this subtle difference in height. When I'm satisfied with the height difference, you might be able to see on the camera, but by wiping it with the sponge, I've exposed the grit in the clay. So if I don't want to see that, I need to go back and compress this area around this so that it's not rough. It's kind of like sandpaper right now. So I need to recompress that and push that that grit back down into the clay. Now I can't take this off right now. I have to wait for this to dry a bit to be able to remove it from the slab. Other form of wiping back is on bone dry clay. Here's a piece of bone dry clay. And when we do it on bone dry clay, we can't use paper. Instead, we use wax. So I talk about this in the glazing video, but here's some wax. We use it with brushes to make sure our brushes don't get destroyed. You're going to wet the brush and rub it in this bar of soap that's up by the wax. It makes a barrier between the wax and the brush. Use the wax with your brush on the design that you want onto your bone dry clay, and then immediately wash your brush out with soap and water and let your wax dry completely before you start doing this. So my wax is dry, so I'm going to take a wet sponge and start to wipe back. And you can pretty immediately see where the wax is, the water isn't getting into the clay, but where the wax isn't, it's starting to get damp and change colors. And I'm just going to wipe back. Bone dry clay dissolves pretty quickly under water, and so you could get a much more defined and extreme embossment this way. You can't really then, it's harder to get rid of that sandpaper texture though, because you can't go back and recompress the clay. So that's just something to be aware of when you're doing this. And this is, I want to show you something to note. The wax we use is not like the most resilient. So you can see that it was a little bit thinner in this area and it's starting to come off. It's a water-based wax. And generally you don't need more than a thin coat of wax, but when you're rubbing at it with the sponge, it can help to make sure it's a little bit thicker so that doesn't happen. But as I rub this away, there is now a raised area where that wax is. The next on the list is carving, and again, that's not something I'm really going to demonstrate. You can carve clay with anything, any tool that takes away material. It's all going to depend on what the tool looks like, what the market makes, and the consistency of your clay when you carve. So it's definitely a good exercise to take different clays at different stages and use the same tool in them and see the marks that you get. When clay is very soft, you're going to get softer marks that are less defined. When clay is harder, they'll be more crisp, but a little bit not as deep and maybe harder to get in there. Same thing with stamping. It's going to depend on the consistency of your clay. So that just takes exploration and thinking about the tools. Let's see what we have so far. I think we can put another layer of slip on our stencils. And it looks like, well, still not quite dry up here. So we need to keep letting that dry. Graffito. So graffito is a technique that involves applying your 3 coats of slip to the surface and then carving back through it down to the clay underneath to create a contrast in color. I generally do that in this section here, and it's still a little bit wet. So we're going to wait on graffito for just a minute, and we'll move on to slip inlay, or mishima as its traditional name. Slip inlay is when we carve inside the lines into the clay in a design of whatever your choosing is. And then we fill that with slip. And then depending on the quality of the line you're looking for, you could use a rubber rib right now and kind of squeegee away some of this slip. And you can see that it kind of squishes the edges a bit. It's not as defined when you do this when the clay is even leather hard. If you're looking for really fine detailed lines, what I would suggest is, I'm going to clean up the rest of this slip. What I would suggest is, if you're looking for fine detail, like this is kind of nice, it's got a nice kind of wavering quality, is apply the slip at leather hard and then wait until it gets to that like chocolate, almost past chocolate stage to scrape this away. And instead of a rubber rib, I'm going to use a flat metal rib, and I'm going to scrape this off gently, gentle pressure, because if I scrape too hard, I'm just going to take off too much, and then I get rid of my line work, especially if my line work is particularly delicate. But make sure you can see that. I've scraped away, you've got all those shavings in my hand, and you can see my really crisp lines that I've made in that clay. So it's a little bit of a wait. Again, timing and process is a big part of clay. Let's see, where are we at? We are still waiting here, still waiting here. We can talk about slip trailing. So slip trailing is when we use a trailing bottle or a dropper to make dots or lines of slip. So this is a dropper that we have in the container, and you can make little dots of slip. You could make a line and a dot. And depending on the consistency of the slip, this can really hold itself up. The screen's a little bit thicker. You can see the dimension it's getting, and that'll stay for the most part. Some of the slips will be a little thinner, might not stand up quite as well. So that's a dropper, and we always want to clean these things when we're finished using them. You don't want the slip to dry out. So this is a slip trailing bottle that I put some slip in using a large syringe, which is in the container with these bottles. and I can, depending on how much I squeeze the bottle, I can get a fine line or a thick line. Had a little air bubble in there, so I got a little bit of blub, but let me get some more down. I didn't put a ton of slip in here because I didn't want to have to get it all back out of the bottle. Need a little bit more slip to give you a really good demonstration, but you can see this line that I did gives a good demonstration of what a slip trailing bottle can do. Get some little blubs here. But yeah, if you fill it up a little bit more, you have a lot more material to work with, and you can get a nice line out of it. There you go. So that's slip trailing. And again, as soon as you are finished, you need to get these bottles cleaned out, get the tips cleaned out so it doesn't dry in there and ruin the bottle. So I'm going to put mine in water so that I can clean it without it getting messed up. All right, so slip trailing is the last example that we do. So now I need to go back and try to get these other things done. So let's start with our monoprint. So this is the monoprint that has different layers and different colors on it that we're going to apply the whole thing to the surface. So I want to make sure that my clay is clean of anything else that I don't want there. This still is a little bit more moist than I would generally do it, so I'm not going to spritz the surface because this is wetter than it would generally be. If this gets to that leather hard stage, you could spritz the surface of your clay just a little bit so that it adheres down. And then we're going to apply pressure. I'm applying pressure with my finger first, and then I want to apply pressure with the back of a spoon or a rib. I don't want to cut the surface of the paper. I want to apply pressure in an even way that's not going to rip the paper and it's not going to cut into the clay. So the back of a spoon is really nice because you can apply pressure in kind of like a circular motion. Same thing with this rubber rib is really nice for that. And again, so with this one, I intentionally left it thin in places to show you what it does when it's thin, because that might be something you want to use, but it's also something to be aware of if you don't want it to happen. So when I feel like this is nice and adhered, I'm going to take a tool and gently lift up the edge here. And I'm going to pull this paper kind of at a diagonal. And what you get is kind of an interesting texture and pattern that you couldn't get by just applying it to the clay. It's a smoother texture than you would get. And I want to point out that these green lines went on first, and I did that much thicker. And then I did the yellow behind it, and I did it thinner. And you can see when it's thin, it tends to pull out and not make a consistent surface, which kind of looks interesting. But I want you to be aware that it does that so you can do it in control rather than it being happenstance. So that is a monoprint. That's one style of monoprint. Let's see if our other monoprint is ready. It is still too wet, so we're going to have to wait on that. Let's see if this is also too wet, so we are going to have to wait on that too. So let's see, we can probably pull up our stencils. It might be a little bit wet. Again, we want to let it get back to leather hard, which is the consistency of this clay. And we're going to look for an edge to start with. And we're going to pull up those stencils. And there we go. You can see that the stencil technique can get you a super, super crisp line, a super, super crisp outline, which can work to your advantage depending on what you're doing. Okay, so let's see if I can get our embossed square up. So peel that up, and I don't know if the camera can pick it up, but if you feel it with your finger, there's a noticeable distinct rise up underneath where the paper was, and has a pretty crisp edge as well. So that's another way of going about that. So we're going to have to take a short break and let these other pieces firm up before I can continue. While we're waiting for some of our slips to set up so we can apply them, I wanted to talk to you about the difference between slips and glazes, or slips and underglazes rather. So slips are liquid clay. They are clay, so once they're applied, they behave just like the clay would. It's just they have a color on them, so they can go on the bottoms of things. They can easily be glazed over, but they have to be fired on. It has to go on at leather hard. The underglazes are a bit different. They're a commercial product, and they act a little bit more like paints as far as color mixing, though if you're going to mix these, do it in small amounts so we're not wasting material, because you can't put them back in the container afterwards. So this is a commercial underglaze, and you can do basically everything I did with the slips you can do with these underglazes. Slips need a solid 3 coats. Underglazes, maybe more like two coats. It depends on what consistency the clay is when you put it on there. At leather hard, maybe you'd need 3. It kind of just depends. They're a little bit, yeah, it just depends on how the clay is and how thick the underglaze is. The underglazes, some of them can go on at bisque as well as at leather hard and bone dry. So the speedball underglaze, these work pretty well on bisque with just putting a glaze over them. We have the other underglazes that are by Amico, and we had some issues with them working on bisqueware and not having the glaze crawl away from it. So I would suggest not using the Amico ones on bisqueware, but you can use the speedball ones on bisqueware. So just things to keep in mind, the differences. Also, we don't put underglazes on the bottoms of things because some of these underglazes get a little bit glossy by themselves, which leads it to cause issues to the shelf. So whatever's touching the shelf shouldn't have underglaze on it, but it can have slip on it. We're back, and I think we're just about there. So this is that monoprint paper. I can touch it without it coming off on my hands. And the edges are starting to curl up, which means it's getting a little bit drier. So I think we're ready to use this. So I'm not going to spritz the surface because I don't want anything to stick that I don't apply pressure to. I'm going to turn this slip side down onto my clay, and I'm not going to adhere it at all. I'm just going to make sure it's sitting there. And I'm going to take whatever it is I want to transfer, if it's a printout or if it's something I've drawn, and I'm going to set that on there, and I'm going to trace. And again, I don't want to apply pressure really anywhere that I'm not tracing. The pressure is what's going to stick the slip down to the clay. So I traced the X that I made. I'm also going to trace this spiral. And I'll trace one of these waves. And then I'm going to draw a small circle here, because I want to show you what this technique can and can't do well. So I'm going to take this off, and I'm going to peel back this paper. And it should only be stuck down where I pressed. So, you can see that this technique, it maybe could have been a little bit drier and it wouldn't have pulled away quite as much. But this technique works well for certain things. Generally, it works pretty well for lines, for things that aren't super tight curves. But it doesn't do as well with like enclosed circles or really tight curves because of the way it tears away. And this, it's only stuck down where I pressed, but it tore away out more. So what I would do is wait for this to firm up a bit, and I could remove this extra slip that isn't actually attached. But it's hard when you get to things that are spirals or circles because it almost invariably leaves that interior. And you can clean that up. You could wait till it's really dry and sort of like till this is getting to almost bone dry, and you could sort of like get it off then because it won't be adhered. But again, that's sort of a patience game that you need to play. So that's that type of monoprint. And as this, we could try it again as it dries. Like, let's see if we can do it on one of the edges that's even more dry. We'll just draw a line and see what it does. And a wavy line. It's not happy with me. So you can see it sort of adheres weird, and it tore out a little bit better there. Again, you've got some extra clay here, but it being a little bit drier helped there. Let's try it again. So you can kind of get a sense of what you get when you do that. And again, even on a really dry area, if I were to do a enclosed circle, it still leaves that center filled. So certain things you can and can't do with that technique. Now we've got this area should be dry now. I'm going to use my paper transfer technique to give myself some things to graffito. You can also graffito freehand. You don't have to have a stencil or a paper transfer if you don't want to, but you can use it that way. And it made the impressions. And now I'm going to take my graffito technique tool, which is this double looped tool, which is this specifically what it's made for. And I'm going to pull away the top layer of slip to reveal the clay underneath. And my goal is to not dig too deep. I'm not trying to remove the clay underneath. I'm just trying to remove the slip that's on top of it. So you can see I can do that and reveal that clay underneath. And then I have a nice contrast of clay. When it's fired, it'll be a dark green and the clay will be an off-white
so it'll contrast very well. So those are all of our slip techniques. Have fun trying those out and see what you like.